It is the 37th day of our expedition. We have traveled 46 hours without stop. We fed our spare mitts and footwear to the dogs, but this was not sufficient. We thus killed 6 dogs to feed to the others and to ourselves.
The high Arctic is not meant for human survival. Canada's extreme north was given to it by Britain, then promptly forgotten by the Canadian government. But foreign explorers were attracted to the ice and the cold and began making plans for the high Arctic. It was almost too late when Ottawa woke up to the danger of losing the far north. But who could go up there on Canada's behalf? Norway is a country that celebrates its Arctic explorers. Otto Sverdrup spent 4 years, from 1898 to 1902, crisscrossing the high Arctic, and then he began making plans.
It was one of the few white areas on the globe, and Otto Sverdrup wanted to put some names and some color on some white spots on the map. This was a day and age, it seems far away now, and it is, when imperialism was not a dirty word. So laying claim to areas was something you did when you went on an expedition. And in the first week of May of 1900, he solemnly laid claim on behalf of the Swedish Norwegian king to these areas, which is today northern Canada. At the time, it obviously did not occur to Otto Sverdrup that this might belong to Canada.
The flag of Norway? Where?
On an island of rock and ice, sir. He discovered it.
But it's Canada. We received it from the Queen.
But we have never been there, sir. The government has never been in the high Arctic.
Well, we must... It's time to make clear that Canada's laws will be enforced in the Arctic. And the natives must be informed that they are Canadian subjects. Someone must go up there. Someone...
Captain Bernier, sir. Captain Bernier is the man for such a mission.
Captain Joseph Bernier spent many seasons sailing through Arctic waters. Wherever Sverdrup, the Norwegian, had left a mark, Captain Bernier and his crew replaced it with a marker saying, "This is Canada." But Europeans and Americans still regarded the high Arctic as no man's land. Stronger measures were needed. In the summer of 1917, Captain Bernier's ship called at northern Greenland, where Canada and Greenland nearly touch. And there he was shocked to discover 150 muskox skins that had been taken on Ellesmere Island, Canadian soil. He cabled Ottawa.
The Greenland Eskimo? They are hunting our muskoxen?
So it appears, sir. I believe they have been hunting on Ellesmere for thousands of years. They call it the land of the muskox.
Never mind. Ellesmere is Canada, and the world must know it. We'll pass a law. Protect the muskox in order to protect Canada. And this time we shall deploy men, the mounted police.
The legendary Mounties had never before put men in the high Arctic. They asked for volunteers, hungry for adventure.
I had been posted to Niagara Falls, where we had no saddle horse but made our patrols in a little whippet car. But lo and behold, I was instructed to report to Toronto and declared fit for the Arctic.
My dad was born in a small town in Ireland, and he served in the Royal Irish Constabulary during the Irish Troubles into the 1920s. When the RIC was disbanded in 1922, he was at loose ends and still seemed to have a taste for adventure, so he emigrated to Canada and joined the RCMP.
As I walked down Yonge Street to the Union Station, I looked at the crowds and wondered just when I would see life like this again. How the Eskimo girls would compare with the ones I was now looking at. So many thoughts passed through my mind as the train pulled out of the station and I was on my way to join the ship for Ellesmere Island.
2 weeks out, we had our first meeting with the pack. That great mass of ice that forms the greatest danger to Arctic navigators. To us greenhorns, the situation looked frightening. This bay is the graveyard of many a fine ship. But Captain Bernier climbed into the crow's nest and ordered full steam from the boilers.
My father was Herbert Patrick Lee. He was an illegitimate child, and so he was a loner. He longed to serve in the Army, and he joined the London Scottish and was at the front at 16, having lied about his age. When he was demobbed, he decided he wanted to start a new life, and he loved adventure, and he joined the Canadian Mounted Police.
All that day, and the following night, the ship echoed to the sound of ice driving against her steel-shod prow. But when we came on deck the next morning, she was in open water, picking away among the icebergs.
Our first stop was a small Eskimo settlement in Greenland. This is where Greenland and Canada are so close you can see across the strait. The North Greenland Eskimo are the only ones who live in that region, and we needed their help to survive. One particular hunter was named Nukapingquak, and he knew the country and the ice caps better than any other native.
There were 2 families in the settlement when our ship pulled in. Captain Bernier went to talk to them. He returned an hour later, followed by a whaleboat full of Eskimos and practically all their belongings. One family refused to leave without the other, and so both were hired at the regulation rate of 40 cents per day, payable in trade goods. The men brought their hunting gear, kayaks, dogs, sealskin tents, piles of muskox bedding, and huge pieces of dried walrus meat and ducks. Every inch of deck was covered with people and animals and piled high with gear.
The North Greenland Inuit have lived and hunted across the high Arctic for 1,000 years. Nukapingwak's descendants live in the world's most northerly community, Sierra Palak. Population, 71 humans and 600 dogs. The people still live as hunters, and some still have fond memories of their lives with the Muskox patrol.
Uncle Harry had an extraordinary amount of respect for his Eskimo companions, the Inuit, and he enjoyed learning from these people.
Dear Brother Bill, I suppose you think I'm quite a drifter. Before the Arctic, my posting was in Jasper, where American millionaires come to rest or climb the Rocky Mountains with Swiss guides. I suppose one should be satisfied with a post like that, but I don't like arresting or prosecuting people or posing to be photographed by flocks of tourists. I never did feel comfortable in clean boots and buttons.
And Aunt Hilda would say that Uncle Harry was a man of the world because he had come from a fine middle-class English background, well-educated. He came to Canada, I think must have been about 1912. There was all kinds of adventurous things that had been going on to Canada. The gold rush was just over, and he was a young constable there.
Finally, after 5 weeks at sea, Ellesmere Island. A gigantic glacier hung over a set of cliffs which plunged into the ocean. The only place we could find to build a post was a small cove sheltered by towering cliffs. It was desolate and barren, but we had no choice. The inspector waved us over to the railing. "Your future home, boys."
For 6 days and nights, a party headed by the ship's carpenter worked around the clock to erect the main building. Snow was drifting, and the men couldn't put down their tools for fear of losing them. Ice threatened to crush the ship. The final evening, a cold, bitter wind was blowing. The ship would now leave, and would not return until a full year later. "Take care of yourselves," Captain Bernier shouted from the bridge. And then we were alone. A few policemen and 2 Eskimo families, the sole inhabitants of 1 million square miles of Arctic wilderness.
How little experience these men had when they went north. None of them virtually had ever been in the Arctic. Mm-hmm. They didn't know what to do. They had to learn everything. The Canadian government had issued them regular woolen clothing, which was perfectly useless in the Arctic. She used to laugh about how they got up there in their wool tunics and so forth, and had to wait for Orla Lou to sew them sealskin outfits.
Sealskin boots. They came up with moccasins in the snow, and wool that would, once it was
That's
wet,
right,
would
yeah.
stand up, it freeze and stand up by itself.
Dear Brother Bill, it's October. You will receive this letter in September next year, after the annual ship has brought me back to the south. As I've written to Mother, when I was stationed in Jasper, I was often seen in the company of a fine young woman, a reverend's daughter and schoolteacher. Her name is Hilda Austin. Don't be surprised if you see some further developments in that department.
I think it must have been love at first sight. That's what I remember Hilda saying. Hilda was a little bit in awe of this person because now he's a man of the world. He's also approximately 10 years older. But she is devoted to him, he to her. So the idea was that yes, Harry would go and they would be married on the next year when he returned. And of course, he would come back with the extra money that he would be paid on top of his RCMP duties, and then they would be quite fixed to be married and start a family.
Winter is approaching. The lights and colors are such as I've never seen before. The landscape outside our little cabin changes constantly. I began to write to you last night, but Nukapingawak and the woman in Alunguak came in for a visit. We had a social evening with biscuits and cocoa, and I tried to explain some of the advertising pictures in the Saturday Evening Post. Headlights to show at night.
One of the problems was to learn the language so they could communicate with the Inuit who they were living with. We were fortunate to have a notebook that Pat Lee kept during his first year there, probably 400 or 500 words. And in the second half of this volume, he transposes all these words alphabetically, so he has a quick means of reaching the word he wants. The word for arm, tadli. The word for face, kina. The word for knee, sirko, and so on.
Ship. 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 Ship.
Those first months were extremely busy. Our assignment was to carry out patrols and mark our presence across Canada's high Arctic. But before we could do so, we had a lot to learn. We were also supposed to protect the muskoxen from the Greenland hunters, but, well, those hunters were now working for us.
By the middle of October, the bay was freezing fast. The natives were becoming impatient to set their sleds in motion and see the new country from the dog and sled angle. We whites were just as eager to see what dog driving would be like. We had spent many hours practicing to use the long driving whip, with very poor results and often with deep wounds. The first time I used a whip, I managed to give myself 2 lovely black eyes with 1 lashing. The sun disappeared on the 5th of November. We take the dog teams out in the dusk, and I've made my first hunting trip with the Eskimos. The objective is to get fresh polar bear and seal meat for the dogs and us. When it came time to build our first snow house, I made quite a nuisance of myself in trying to help. But the natives were very patient, and I felt quite proud when I managed to cut a snow block which they were able to use.
Newcap and Uncle Harry were out someplace, maybe part of a patrol, maybe they had gone hunting. And there's just the two of them, I believe. And a snow bridge lets loose. And Harry thunders down this crevasse. So about 15 feet below, beyond hand's reach, he is jammed in this hourglass shape, knocks the breath out of him, and he's unconscious.
You shot me! Harry! You shot me! Harry! You shot me! Harry!
Newcap, he sits at the top looking down in the crevasse, and Harry regains consciousness. Harry can now raise his hands. And he always said if it was anybody else than Newcap, they would have looked down and said, oh, he's dead. Harry's almost lost his life a couple of times before, but he felt that was the most serious one, and probably the scariest too.
It was a miracle that we all managed to get through those first months. By the time Christmas Day arrived, I had learned many things about survival in the north. I was ready for the long, dark spell ahead. We started off celebrations with drinks for the whites and soft drinks for the Eskimos. Then we all sat down for dinner, which consisted of ptarmigan with all the fixings and was topped off with a Christmas cake which the inspector produced from a sealed tin he had carefully hoarded.
A toast to friendship.
Friendship.
Cheers. Here, here.
Deck the halls with boughs of holly.
Then we sang a few songs and played games with the Eskimos until 11 p.m.
Jolly, fa la 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 la. Down we now our gay apparel, fa la 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 la. Sing the ancient.
Outside, the night had turned cold and clear.
The Arctic winter evokes the sense of a vast universe. The Mounties settle into the darkness, thinking they will return home in 6 months. But in Norway, the explorer Otto Sverdrup renews his claim to the high Arctic.
Sverdrup was always unlucky when it came to money and when it came to timing. So he was almost always out of money. And the claim to what is now northern Canada was only renewed in the 1920s when he was an old man, and he found out that the Norwegian government had done nothing, and he became very angry. So he said, if you don't do anything, I'll sell the diaries and the claim to the Canadian government.
Well then, so we pay off the Norwegian. But now what? Someone else also wants this blasted wilderness?
Americans, sir. Explorers. Macmillan and Byrd. They have aeroplanes, and the American press says the land is up for grabs.
Let's see. The North Pole is already American by virtue of Robert Peary planting the national colors. So why shouldn't any new land be claimed by Americans? We will show them national colors. Alert our men! Alert our men! Alert our men! Alert our men!
Suddenly, the Mounties are needed more than ever. But their only communication with Ottawa is by listening to regular radio, American stations only.
I now present Major Edward Bow.
Good evening, friends. And we extend a hand clasp of friendship across the border to one of Canada's great and prosperous cities. We're happy to salute Montreal. The Montreal telephone number is Bel Air 3737. Please jot it down.
It's a one-way link from south to north, and the men of the Muskox Patrol are told to remain in the Arctic for 1 more year.
Oh, Hilda, oh dear. Months and months of hearing nothing from each other. It's a long time to hope that a young and desirable girl will still be free to say yes to a man with such a strange urging for the Arctic. I pray you are still there, feeling as I do about our future together.
She is not somebody that is going to break down in tears and be hysterical about anything. I think she's quite philosophical about whatever comes along she will deal with. And I'm going to really stick with him because he's somebody important to me, and I find him terrifically fascinating, and I'm really in love with him. But on the other hand, can I fit into his lifestyle? I see him as a man of the world because he's done all these things. How will it come together? Will it work?
The first thing I will do when I return to the south is to take the train west to see my dear little pal and to ask her parents, especially your mother, for final permission to marry you. Now that I have 17 years of service, perhaps I can take a pension in 3 years and get started on a whole new life of better earning capacity. We can look forward to many good years together, a good home, and, I hope, Hilda, a small family. Brother Bill, old man. Sometimes we get our patience tested. I have 214 fox furs trapped by myself or traded from the Eskimos during the past winter. But the new officer in command is a perfect arse. He says we have been taking part in a profitable business against rules and regulations, and so he's confiscated all the furs caught by the boys in the north, $12,000 worth.
From what my father told me, when the men first went north, the commanding officer encouraged the men to actually run the trap lines because it gave them something to do during the long Arctic night. Unfortunately, this officer died while these men were at Bash Peninsula. And so the inspecting officer was a new man who was not aware of the permission that the men had been given.
Harry and the fox furs, and you know, he never forgot about the injustice of that. And in 1930, was it? Imagine how much money $3,000 would buy you. Extraordinary.
Hilda, my dearie, I've been in a flat spin over this fox fur business. Darling, every time I took a fox out of a trap, I thought, there's another chair or something for our home, or maybe a wheel of a new car. Now, my $3,000 worth is a total loss. It's hard for me, dear, to tell you this, because we were counting on this income when we decided I should come north. And especially now that we are stuck here for one more year. I have lost my bearings. I did not want to keep you to a promise when I left. I want you to live your life, even if it means I will lose you. But there are a number of confidences I want to share with you, no matter what the outcome. I cannot wait to see you again.
One night of our second winter, the post nearly came to an end. It was the worst blizzard of the winter. It was as if the world was in an uproar. We were in the kitchen when suddenly I smelled smoke. The burlap lining around the stovepipe was on fire. We were worse than helpless. I dashed out into the blinding drift. I climbed onto the roof to shovel snow onto the flames that were now bursting through. But snow filled my eyes and the lashes froze. Our building was doomed. The last we saw of it was a mass of blazing red embers licking upward through the storm. We managed to save the bedding, our rifles, and one case of ammunition. The Eskimos were all badly frostbitten, helping to get us and our gear into the tiny blubber shed.
But by now, the men of the Muskox patrol are no longer greenhorns. They build igloos, they go on patrol with their dog teams. They have plenty to occupy their minds.
Even with Eskimos like Itukasuk and Nukapingquak, it's hard to believe that we haven't lost any men. I've been there for many a close brush with death, especially out on the sea ice in the icy fog. I was coming home one day when the dog suddenly turned sharply. The ice had broken off and the dog saw it. But the sled did not turn fast enough, and before I realized what was happening, both the sled and I were in the water. It was cold, at least 30 below. My parka froze to my body as soon as I crawled back onto the ice. A knight in armor had nothing on me and my skin clothing.
Bastard! Bastard! You son of a bitch!
When I first met Paddy Hamilton, he was the quartermaster. He was a very loud, boisterous type of individual. So he would be in his office at moments there, and I would be doing some menial little chore in the stores, and he'd shout in Eskimo to me, and of course, I'd look around and be embarrassed, and then I'd have to try and answer what he came up with.
And the one thing that I remember my Uncle Harry telling me about was Paddy Hamilton's cooking. And it's not that he was a bad cook at all, but he was so messy because you've got this small confined space and you've got a few things on shelves. And Paddy would take everything down and everything would be all spread out and he'd be making bannock or whatever it was, and there'd be flour everywhere and salt spilled and all this sort of thing. And there's this mess still in the kitchen. And it drove Harry crazy. And Hilda cooked the same way, because he walked in one time when she was making a cake and all the spices were out in the cupboard and flour every place, and she was taking the cake out of the oven, and he said, you know, you cook just like Paddy Hamilton. Look at this mess.
Imagine being confined together for months at a time in a 3-room detachment. Of course there was going to be friction, perhaps even a fight.
I told you to lay off. Get out of the way! You're going nowhere! I warn you, get out of the way, bastard!
There is an occurrence where Paddy had done something and kept irritating Harry to the point.
I warn you! Drop that knife, you son of a bitch! Get out of the way!
I don't know what started it off. Cabin fever, I would imagine.
Out of the way! Shut up, bastard!
I can't imagine this happening, but my Uncle Harry said, you know, I just decked him.
You son of a bitch! You
Knuckle sandwich right between the eyes and knocked out a couple of his teeth, too. And I remember thinking, my uncle did this?
The only permanent damage seemed to be to my father's teeth, which required some dental work when he returned south. The Arctic doesn't leave you enough room to hold personal grudges. It's much too dangerous for that.
(1931). The Norwegian has been paid, the Americans have lost interest. Ottawa is finally ready to bring the Muskox patrol home. But there is still one problem, the German Arctic expedition.
In the spring of 1930, at the RCMP post at Batch Peninsula, an expedition turns up out of the blue, a German geologist called Kruger, and where he was heading for was right across Ellesmere Island and out to the outer coast of Axel Heiberg Island.
Very few people had ever traveled on that coast. Kruger's dog sled is overloaded. Kruger himself is sick. The Mounties felt the expedition was doomed from the start.
After about a year, when they didn't turn up, his family back in Germany got in touch with the Canadian government. Harry Stallworthy and Paddy Hamilton, being the experienced men on the spot, they got the job of going looking for Kruger and his party.
The German request was a recognition that the high Arctic belonged to Canada. Whatever the chances of success, the RCMP search patrol became an important official gesture.
To me, it seemed like an impossible feat. You know, it's finding a needle in a haystack situation.
Hilda, oh dearie. Oh, I wish this Kruger business had never happened, or we would have been together by now. I'm nearly 40, and I warn you that you're going to see some grey hairs. But don't let that fool you. There's a very young set of ideas inside this grey thatch. One day we shall be together. Won't it be wonderful, you dear sweet lover? You know I'm in a flat spin, and you're the only one who can bring me out of it. Good night, my darling. Harry.
They left in late March, this being the best time of the year for traveling. The days are getting longer with more daylight, and yet it's still cold enough so that the snow is firm for good sledding.
From my experiences, you actually go out sort of being dependent on the game that's going to be along the course. But to me, that looked like a very difficult and impossible trip that I wouldn't want to be involved in, actually.
March the 28th. We have split into several teams in order to cover more territory. Stallworthy's team is following Kruger's direction. My team will try to locate his return route. Our progress is extremely slow, with one blizzard after another. Some days, we encounter pressure ridges that exhaust the men and dogs and break the sleds.
The real limitation in a trip like this is the dog feed. The Inuit usually carry about 3 days' supply of dog feed on the Kamatik and hunt along the way to provide additional food for the dogs. This means walrus meat, seal meat, polar bear meat. Where my father and Stallworthy were going, there were no walrus to be had, and hence no polar bear. And the dogs would very quickly be in a starving condition.
We stop regularly along the shoreline to look for any traces of the Kruger party. There are none. Day 15. We found a cairn, but there was no message from Kruger. 4 of our dogs died from starvation 2 days ago. They were eaten by their mates. We have begun to walk beside the sleds, yet 5 more dogs died yesterday and today. We've lost 17 in all. But we don't talk about it. All of us nibble on the dog flesh we carry on our sleds, simply to avoid collapse.
Etukasuk knew of a cairn at Cape Hubbard, erected by Robert Peary in 1906. We reached the Cape after a 24-hour day. The cairn was drifted high with snow. Here I finally found the first trace of Kruger's expedition. A record they had left on April 24th, 1930 was in German, and I did not fully understand it. However, it was evident they intended to head for Meean Island, 3 days sledding across the frozen polar sea. But our situation has now become untenable. Of the dogs, we are only feeding the bitches, which the natives are anxious to save if they lose their teams through starvation. We have thus decided to cut short our search and instead head for our emergency food cache at Cape Southwest.
That's a major crisis, and I'm surprised they got to that point. Who's to say at some point they don't get one of the big blizzards, you know? And 1 or 2 days being holed up in an igloo could have been the end of them right there.
It is our worst crisis so far. I have to stop and sit down at short intervals. We are still far away from our food cache.
We were now desperate for fresh meat. Just before camping time, Nuka Pinkwak spotted a large bear coming straight towards us. He was probably as hungry as we were. Nuka jumped off his sled and took the best dogs and headed off the animal. He fired once and we could see the bear drop. The three of us approached the bear. We were perhaps 10 yards away when he sprang up and charged Nuka, knocking him down with a slashing blow that tore right through Nuka's parka. I think Kukutsiak and I must have fired at the same time. Anyway, we killed him just as he came around to charge again. Nuka had a deep gash in his hip, and I had to stitch him up. But soon he was back on his feet, saying the important thing was that we now had dog feed.
Today, the natives urgently requested to shoot muskoxen. I deeply regret having been in a position where it became necessary to do so.
It was his turmoil of being a policeman. It was a political thing more for the Canadian government to say, we don't want this trade in muskox, but I can imagine his Eskimo companions thought that this whole idea was a bit nuts. And you know, how long could he have kept them from killing something? I mean, if you're starving to death, why aren't you going to shoot a muskox? I mean, it's a given.
It is against the provisions of the Games Act, and it is directly against my own personal feelings. I have finally consented to the killing of 6 bulls.
Today our team held council. Nuka Pinkwak said flatly that it would be disastrous for us to travel any further. I'm convinced he is right, but at the same time I experienced a feeling of disappointment and failure in my mission.
Paddy more or less obeyed No'Kak Benoit, which is good. Like if he didn't, I'm sure they wouldn't be here, or they wouldn't have got back. No'Kak Benoit at least had sense enough to know when to say quits.
After nearly 2 months of searching, the patrol still had no explanation for the disappearance of the Kruger expedition. The most likely explanation seemed to be that the Kruger expedition had starved to death. The members returned to the detachment, looking forward now to finally going home. Unfortunately, the supply ship did not come. So they had to spend another year on Ellesmere Island.
We counted the months, weeks, and days. The one who suffered the most was Corporal Stallworthy, who's engaged to be married and is already 2 years delayed. We could only think of one thing. Would the ship make it through the pack ice? This was the only subject we wanted to discuss. It had been 2 years since we had seen other white people. We knew each other's life stories and tall tales by heart. It was best to remain silent. And when I finally saw the wisp of smoke on the horizon, well, it became almost impossible to talk at all.
In the south, Hilda had indeed waited for Harry, and they were married as soon as she could get herself to Ottawa. Their niece, Elaine, became the daughter they never had. Pat Lee was married in New York and left the force. He became a journalist and author, traveling the world, but was killed when his daughter Joan was only a toddler. Paddy Hamilton remained a northern man. He met his wife on board the supply ship. With their 2 daughters, the Hamiltons lived in many Arctic communities. Nukapingwak and his large family kept traveling and hunting on Ellesmere Island until the next generation of police, knowing nothing of the history, told him that, as a foreigner, he was not welcome in Canada. It broke his heart. Their years on the Muskox patrol marked each one of these men, even as their memories grew sweeter with the years.
Now, as far as I'm concerned, that year that I was supposedly marooned, it was my best year. And I'll tell you why. I had raised my own dogs. I'd become more proficient and knew more about the language variation with the North Greenland people we traveled with. And I had also done a lot of practicing building snow houses. I had become a real northern man.